That night in the upper room, Jerusalem pulsed with unease. The air outside was heavy with the scent of iron and smoke. And in the shadowed alleys below, Roman patrols stalked the city like predators sensing blood. But above the chaos, hidden behind thick stone walls and a bolted wooden door, a different kind of moment unfolded. Not with the 12, but with 3, the inner circle. Peter, James, John, the ones who had seen the light split open on the mountain, the ones who had watched time collapse at the moment of transfiguration. To them, and only them, Jesus gave something the world was never meant to remember. Before we go further, pause for a moment. If something in these words stirs your curiosity, if a part of you already feels the gravity of this hidden story, subscribe to this channel now. Comment where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is as you hear this. And if the mystery in the title already makes sense to you, if you're beginning to feel why these 3 sacred items matter, then share this video with someone else who might be ready to understand. Let the algorithm fight against awakening. Let resonance do its quiet work. He placed before them 3 objects. Simple, physical, ordinary in appearance, yet radiating with a resonance that did not belong to this realm. Oil, salt, bread. Not metaphor, not symbol, actual tools, carriers of frequency, designed for a singular purpose: to repel the Archons. These were the ancient jailers of this world, unseen architects who harvested the divine sparks trapped in flesh. Jesus, fully aware of what loomed beyond the cross, did not merely offer teachings that could be memorized or debated. He handed them technology. He transmitted liberation encoded in matter. The church would erase this. They would redact, reframe, and silence every trace. Councils met in hushed rooms, debating how far the story could be allowed to stretch before snapping the leash of doctrine. The Gnostic texts, buried in jars beneath the Egyptian sands for 1600 years, were left to rot while Rome sculpted a new narrative. But fragments remained. In the Gospel of Philip, in whispered rituals, in relics of a memory too dangerous to preserve, what the priests would later call sacraments began here. Not as symbolic rites, but as direct transmissions of power. The oil was not for scent, it was a shield. The salt was not seasoning, it was a purifier. The bread was not memory, it was union. These elements, when consecrated with full intention, produced vibrations the Archons could not withstand. Not theory, not poetry. Frequency, energy, law. You were never meant to know this. That is why this information feels familiar. Not because you were taught it, but because the spark within you never forgot. If you have ever felt hunted by something without a face, drained by invisible hands, or blocked every time your soul tried to rise, it is because the system is designed to suppress light. You found this now because part of you is ready to remember. Not just the story, but the tools. And what Jesus gave his closest followers that night was a promise encoded in substance. That the cage could be cracked. That light, in alignment with light, is untouchable. This is not about belief. It is about mechanics. The items you are about to rediscover were never dependent on doctrine. They were functional, replicable, hidden not because they were unimportant, but because they worked. And the church could not afford for ordinary people to walk around carrying something that made them immune to fear. The Archons feed on low vibration, but these 3 keys disrupted the frequency field they relied upon to sustain control. And so the church buried the items in ritual, wrapped them in Latin, and placed them behind altars. Bread became ceremony. Salt dissolved in holy water. Oil reduced to gesture. But the knowledge, the actual method, was severed from the substance. Until now, you have been taught to seek outside yourself. But Jesus placed the power directly in the hands of the awakened. That night, in a locked room lit only by flame, he gave not just teachings, but technology. 3 sacred tools that would echo across centuries. Tonight, you will remember them. You were not born into freedom. You were born into a simulation. A counterfeit cosmos built not by the true source, but by a lesser architect. The Gnostics called this architect the demiurge, the blind god, the craftsman who fashioned the visible universe not out of love but out of error. And what he built was not a creation, but a containment, a closed system wrapped in cycles of birth and death, pleasure and pain, hope and despair. A trap designed to keep the divine spark asleep inside the human form. But above him, beyond all hierarchies of angels and lords, shines the monad, the true source, pure, undivided consciousness, a realm of stillness where no separation exists, no division between self and other. It is from the monad that your essence originates, a fragment of the infinite light placed within matter, flickering through lifetimes, aching to remember what it once was. The demiurge cannot reach this realm. He does not know it exists. He believes himself to be supreme, proclaiming, "I am God, and there is none beside me." But that voice is not truth. It is delusion echoed through the ages. Between the monad and this world stands a barrier enforced by his servants, the Archons. These are not demons in the way religion taught you, not horned monsters from medieval imagination. They are forces, systems, algorithms woven into the architecture of reality. They specialize in manipulation, confusion, fragmentation. Their purpose is to keep the spark unaware, to block it from accumulating the energetic momentum needed to pierce the veil. Every fear you have ever felt, every cycle of addiction, every loop of self-sabotage, it is part of the architecture. The Archons cannot create, they can only imitate, distort, and feed. They feed not on your flesh, but on your frequency, on despair, on confusion, on emotional collapse. Their reach is long, but not infinite. And this is where the mystery deepens. They cannot touch what vibrates above their spectrum. Their influence is dependent on resonance. Like radio waves, they can only access what tunes into their channel. Shift your channel, and you become unreachable. This is what Jesus knew, what he embodied, not just as a teacher, but as a transmission. The Gnostics saw him not as a man bearing doctrine, but as a living emanation from the monad itself. He came not to start a religion, but to wake the imprisoned sparks. And he brought with him tools, actual tools to help them ascend. Not parables, not metaphors, technologies disguised as rituals, encoded to survive centuries of suppression. The upper room was not just the site of a last meal, it was a lab of liberation. And the three sacred items, oil, salt, and bread, each contain the signature of frequencies the Archons cannot withstand. Jesus did not tell his closest followers simply to believe. He gave them instruments to shift their field. That is why the early church feared the Gnostics. Not because they were heretics, but because they knew too much. Because they refused to surrender power to a hierarchy. They understood that salvation was not something dispensed by institutions, but activated by remembering. And remembering begins when you see clearly that this world is not what it claims to be. The prison only holds those who forget they were never meant to stay. The first object Jesus placed before them that night was oil. Not as fragrance, not as ornament, but as a seal. In the ancient world, oil was never trivial. It was medicine, illumination, preservation, and power. Kings were anointed with it, priests were marked by it, bodies were prepared with it for burial. Oil was the substance that crossed boundaries between the physical and the unseen. Jesus understood this deeply, and the Gnostic texts preserve what later doctrine tried to flatten into symbol. The Gospel of Philip states something that unsettles Orthodox theology even now. It says the anointing is superior to baptism. That people are not called Christians because of water, but because of the oil. The word Christ itself means the anointed one. This was not linguistic coincidence. It was instruction. The oil carried something water could not. It held intention. It bound frequency. It sealed light within matter. This oil was not poured randomly. It was applied deliberately to specific points of the body. The forehead, the center of the chest, the hands, these were not arbitrary locations chosen for ritual beauty. They were energetic interfaces. Points where consciousness touches the material world most directly. The Archons, masters of interference, target these gates relentlessly. Thought, emotion, action. When these three are disrupted, the spark fragments and weakens. The oil was designed to interrupt that process. When consecrated with conscious intention, the oil became a living boundary, a frequency barrier. The Gospel of Philip describes those who receive the anointing as receiving the light, and then it says something precise and terrifying to the system of control. Those who receive the light cannot be seen by the Archons. They cannot be detained. This is not metaphor. This is operational language. Invisibility through resonance. Freedom through frequency. The early church kept the oil. They kept the ceremony. But they stripped it of its explanation. They removed the knowledge of why it worked. They made the ritual dependent on priests who themselves no longer understood its mechanics. What was once a tool of liberation became an empty performance. Authority was centralized. Access was restricted. And people were taught to wait passively instead of activating their own protection. But the oil never lost its capacity. Olive oil, used across ancient traditions, carries a molecular structure uniquely suited to holding intention. When charged with focused awareness, it becomes an extension of the inner state. Jesus did not choose it by chance. He chose it because it listens, because it remembers what is placed into it, because it can carry the imprint of the monad into flesh. This is why the anointing frightened the Archons. It did not require belief in doctrine. It required presence, awareness, alignment. A person who knows what they are sealing becomes difficult to influence. Their thoughts stabilize. Their emotional field coheres. Their actions become intentional rather than reactive. The oil does not give power. It reveals it. What was given that night was not magic. It was instruction encoded in substance. A method for sealing the light against intrusion. A reminder that the body is not a prison by default, but a vessel that can be fortified. The oil was the first key. A quiet one, subtle, but devastating to those who depend on fragmentation to survive. The second item Jesus gave that night was even simpler. Salt. In its plainness, many would overlook it, but those who understood the old ways knew otherwise. Salt was never just a mineral. It was a guardian, a purifier, a threshold between the seen and unseen. In nearly every ancient tradition, salt was the substance that marked boundaries, cast out decay, and preserved that which held value. To the untrained eye, it was just seasoning. But to the awakened, it was protection coded into crystal. Jesus' words, recorded in the Gospel, ring with layered meaning. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its savor, how shall it be salted? These were not culinary musings. They were encrypted instructions. Salt that loses its essence becomes inert, spiritually and physically. It must be alive, charged with intention, and recognized for what it is, a vibrational threshold that the Archons cannot pass. The Archons, those invisible siphons of energy, do not thrive in high-frequency environments. They feed on distortion, particularly emotional rot, fear, shame, anxiety, confusion. When a person's energy field begins to corrode under the weight of these states, they become visible to these predatory intelligences. Salt was designed to interrupt that process. It preserves integrity. It purifies distortion. It sharpens the signal of the spark within so that interference becomes impossible. The ancient initiates knew this well. Salt was placed in doorways, beneath beds, around the edges of sleeping spaces, not out of superstition, but because night is when you are most vulnerable. It is when the conscious mind releases its grip, and other influences attempt to slip through. Blessed salt marked the territory of the sacred. It said, "Here, Only light may pass. But more than that, salt was consumed. When blessed with words of power and taken into the body, it changed something at the cellular level. Your physical form is not a separate entity from your energy. They are interlaced, mirroring one another. Charged salt enters your bloodstream, influencing the electrical rhythms of your system. And in that act, it raises your frequency. Not symbolically, mechanically. Modern systems have stripped this from you. The salt on your table has been bleached, processed, deadened. The intention has been drained, the understanding lost. They have trained you to avoid salt and fear, not knowing that unrefined, natural salt, when blessed, is one of the few remaining physical substances capable of holding light with integrity. This is why the early church diluted the practice. Salt became something hidden in holy water, administered by priests in ceremonies whose origins had been buried. You were never taught that you could bless it yourself, that your voice, your intention, was enough, that salt responds to sovereignty, that it respects command. The second item was not glamorous. It was not wrapped in gold. It was granules of the earth, vibrating with remembrance. Jesus gave it to the chosen ones because he knew what was coming. He knew what hunted them, and he gave them the most ancient of tools to carve out sanctified space. Not through belief, but through boundary. Of the three sacred items, bread is the one most misunderstood. For generations, it has been remembered as mere symbol broken in ritual, passed in ceremony, tasted but never truly seen. Yet, in that upper room, bread was not an emblem. It was a key, a unifying force, a sacred substance encoded with coherence. When Jesus broke the bread and shared it with his chosen ones, he was not performing a memorial. He was engineering unity, an act that brought fragmented sparks into a single, radiant field no longer penetrable by the Archons. The Gospel of Philip hints at this mystery, calling the sacred meal a mystery of union. To eat the bread in presence was to dissolve the illusion of separation. The self became whole. The community became one body, not metaphorically, energetically. Each participant's frequency was drawn upward and harmonized. The Archons, who thrive on isolation and distortion, could not enter such a space. It was, to them, an impenetrable wall of light. Modern systems have inverted this truth. Today's bread is dead, stripped of life, filled with chemical stabilizers, manufactured without soul or presence. What once carried intention now carries inertia. But in the early gatherings of the awakened, bread was made by hand. Every fold of dough, every breath in the rising, every moment of baking held intention. It was charged with the vibration of awareness, and that awareness entered the body when consumed, aligning flesh and spirit in sacred convergence. Jesus understood this. He had no interest in ritual for the sake of repetition. What he gave was rooted in the laws of energy. The Archons do not simply fear unity, they cannot survive in it. Their control is contingent on fragmentation within the self, within families, within communities. But bread consecrated and consumed with presence breaks those divisions. It relinks the scattered, fuses the shattered, recalls the pieces of the divine spark back into a field too coherent to manipulate. You must understand, your body is not a passive shell. It is an instrument. What you place into it either distorts or aligns its frequency. The modern world knows this and has weaponized food to keep your vibration low. But what you prepare with intention, what you consume with reverence, becomes an act of rebellion, of reclamation. The early church preserved the ritual but erased the knowing. Communion became performance. The bread became doctrine. And your role was reduced to that of observer, a participant without power. But Jesus gave the bread not to be handed down by hierarchy, but to be shared among equals. He gave it to those who remembered, to those who would carry the light forward, intact. In the ancient texts, the breaking of bread is described as a transmission, not of words, not of teaching, but of frequency, When the chosen ones ate together, their fields synchronized. The meal was the method. Unity was the outcome. That is the secret the Archons feared most. Not that humans would find truth, but that they would find each other. What was taken was never the objects themselves. Oil still exists. Salt still exists. Bread still exists. What was stolen was authority. The knowledge that you do not need permission to activate what already responds to you. The early church did not ban the sacred items outright. That would have raised suspicion. Instead, they hollowed them out. They told you the power lived in buildings, in robes, in titles. They taught you to kneel instead of remember, and in doing so, they ensured the Archons would never lack fuel. Jesus never taught hierarchy. The monad does not recognize rank. It recognizes frequency. The spark within you is not lesser than the spark within Peter or James or John. It is the same light, fragmented only by forgetting. That night in the upper room was not exclusive because of status. It was precise because of readiness. The chosen ones were not chosen by blood or birth, but by resonance. They could hold what was given without distorting it. This is why the resistance rises when remembrance approaches. Doubt, delay, that quiet voice telling you this is too simple or not urgent. That is not intuition. That is interference. The Pistis Sophia describes this clearly. The Archons insert thoughts and emotions like hooks, keeping the spark suspended in hesitation. If this knowledge were harmless, there would be no resistance. Systems do not defend against irrelevance. They defend against threat. The three sacred items work because they obey law, not belief. Oil holds intention. Salt establishes boundary. Bread creates coherence. These are not mystical claims. They are ancient observations of how matter and consciousness interact. Everything vibrates. Thought vibrates. Emotion vibrates. Spoken words shape the field. When intention is clear and present, matter becomes responsive. The items alone do nothing. Activated, they become anchors that stabilize your frequency beyond archonic perception. This is why timing matters. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Activation happens in state. Right now. Your awareness has been elevated by remembering. The field is open. If you delay, the system resets. Familiarity returns. Doubt settles back in. That is how forgetting perpetuates itself. Not through force, but through postponement. The return of the keys is not ceremonial. It is practical. You seal the entry points of your field. You mark your space. You unify what has been scattered. And in doing so, you reclaim what was always yours. Not as rebellion against religion, but as alignment with origin. The monad does not demand worship. It responds to recognition. The Archons cannot stop this. They can only distract. They cannot penetrate coherence. They dissolve in the presence of unified light. This is why unity has always been attacked. Why isolation is normalized. Why fragmentation is rewarded. A unified spark does not generate harvest. It generates escape. The three sacred items were never meant to stay buried. They waited. In texts hidden under sand. In rituals stripped of meaning. In substances still present in every home. Waiting for those whose frequency would recognize them again. Tonight is not special because of superstition. It is special because you are awake enough to act. The tools are simple because truth always is. Complexity is the mask of control. Simplicity is the language of liberation. The keys have returned to your hands. What you do with them determines whether remembrance becomes experience or fades back into story. The monad does not compel. It waits.